ones. I want to cover what it takes to swap a ZF5 speed into a truck that had T19 4-speed. Here we have the ZF5 5-speed transmission. Don't mind the grease and the crud and the oil on it. It'll get cleaned up, but it's a little greasy. The transmission itself's not leaking. It's on the motor. It's traveling down when I'm driving and getting all over everything. So this should apply to any rig that you're running. You're doing a swap from a T19 4-speed to a ZF5 5-speed 4x4 transmission. What are you going to need for this swap? So here's the old T19 4-speed. Let's talk about it for a minute. T19 is a good transmission. It's heavy duty, it's reliable, but you're limited with 4 gears. You only have 4 forward gears. You can only go so fast on the highway. When I had this transmission in my rig, it was screaming down the highway with my 410 rear gearing and my large tires. It was screaming down the highway going 55 or 60, and I was getting about 14 to 15 miles a gallon. Now back in the 80s that's fine, but in today's world where diesel fuel's $4 a freaking gallon, clearly this is a little outdated. So I wanted overdrive, and I went with the ZF5 because it will bolt in. I mean, when I don't mean bolt in you gotta make a bunch of modifications. I've heard bolt in from a ton of people. It just bolts in. You just gotta drill a bunch of holes out, and you gotta do this and that and the other, and wiggle it around, and it'll fit. Not the case with this transmission. From the face of the bell housing to the tail shaft, stubby tail shaft here, the ZF5 is the same length. You do not have to modify your drive shafts. Again, the drive shafts are going to be the same. Okay, the drive shafts. This is a T19 drive shaft, and this is a BorgWarner 1345 transfer case. So the length here is the same. So when you bolt everything up, this will be in the same position that it was with the T19. But what happens is this mount, the mount itself on the T19s is forward a little bit more because of where it sits on the T19. On the ZF5s, it's further back on the transmission itself. So the crossmember and the mount have to move back. But the overall length from the end of the transfer case, so this, I guess, this yoke, it's a fixed bolt yoke. So from this yoke to the engine is exactly the same length when you're swapping these transmissions out. The bolt pattern on the bell housing is exactly the same. You don't have to swap out your transfer case because the spline count on the output shaft of your T19 is exactly the same spline count as the output shaft on your ZF5. The bolt pattern on your tail shaft housing for your T19 to your BorgWarner 1345 transfer case is exactly the same as the ZF5's tail housing. It has the same bolt pattern. The locating pin is in the same spot. The crossmember itself is going to have to get moved back a little bit too. So you might have to drill out some new holes in your frame to make it fit. You're going to want to move it back about an inch. I wouldn't quote me on an inch, but it's more or less an inch back. I recommend swapping out cross members. It seems kind of silly, but the later model rigs run a different transmission cross member. It hangs lower. The ZF5 transmission mounting plate actually sits a lot lower, maybe like a couple inches lower than what your cross member is going to allow. And what that will do is, if you try and run your factory cross member with your ZF5 transmission, it is going to push the output of the transmission up, and it's going to screw with your clearance in your tunnel, and it's going to screw with your driveline angle. So I recommend if you're going to the, I mean, I recommend going to the junkyard and getting a ZF5. I don't know if you want to try buying yours online brand new. If you go to the junkyard, you're gonna have a way better time. If you don't, if you want to get a brand new rebuilt ZF5, more power to you. But you are gonna have to either make or modify or go to the junkyard and get a different transmission crossmember. They bolt in, so it shouldn't be too difficult. You gotta get the crossmember, and I believe you gotta get the crossmember gussets off of a different truck, like a 90s rig with a 7.3 and a ZF5. The whole crossmember has to move back a little bit, and like it's got to be slung lower than your factory crossmember. But if you do that, it will bolt right up. This transmission will bolt right in. This crossmember will bolt right in. The other advantage to running this crossmember over the factory one is your drive shaft clearance is way greater. The old crossmember, the original crossmember, it barely clears, and I don't recommend doing that. You change your lift in your springs, or you go over bumps, you're going to be god awful close to touching your drive shaft, and that ain't going to be pretty. So the only thing I replaced here was the crossmember, the transmission, and the clutch, and that's it. It is as close to bolt up and bolt on as you can get. This swap can be completed in under a day. Granted, you're gonna need either a jack and some wit, or what I recommend is a transmission jack. Now, what I did notice was that the T19s, the gear stick sat a little bit further up, and I had to, for this truck, I had to bend it to clear so I wasn't hitting my fingers against the dash. But the ZF5s, the shift tower sits a little bit further back than the T19, so the gear stick will move back a little bit. I don't believe you're going to have to do a whole lot of modification to your trans tunnel. The ZF5 does sit a little bit higher, but I don't think you'll have any issues with the trans tower, the shift tunnel, when you swap transmissions. You don't need to modify anything with your slave cylinder either. It goes in the same location, uses the same clip, it's got the same fork. Connector for the switch plug from your T19 will fit right there in your ZF5 transmission. One thing you might have to think about when you're swapping the transmission out is the shift linkage for the transfer case. If you have electronic shift on the fly, you don't have to worry about that. But if you don't, if you have a mechanical floor shift, which I prefer, the rod is going to be the same length, and you can reuse your arm from your T19. There's that big bolt up there that bolts into one of these two bosses on the transmission. On the T19, I believe it's the rear boss, but on the ZF5, it's going to be the front boss. So you'll see one of these will work and one of these won't work. So the bolt is exactly the same, the threads are exactly the same, and the thread length is exactly the same. So when you're doing the swap, all you have to do is when you take the T19 out, you want to unbolt the pivot point for the floor shift arm and keep that. When you put the ZF5 in and bolt it up, then you just come back with this assembly here and bolt it in, and it should be the front boss is going to work. The rear boss won't work. It'll throw you that shifter all the way into the floor, and you won't be able to make it fit. So it's in the same location. Here's a short and sweet on gear rollover noise. Sounds like a grinding transmission when you're sitting there in neutral at idle. It sounds horrible. It sounds like you got marbles in your transmission. I've heard on the forums you can overfill a ZF5 by a quart. It'll quiet things down. Maybe, but I don't recommend overfilling oil on anything. Why? Because aeration, not good. You get air bubbles in that oil, now it's not lubricating like it's supposed to. Or, in a less serious case, you get oil coming up out of your vents, it makes a dang mess. Not good either. So, if you want to curb gear rollover noise, you gotta dampen the inputs from the motor into the transmission. Either that or just never idle the thing, which I've been told that too. That's a load of horse crap as far as I'm concerned. If you can drive around and never ever idle, more power to you. If you don't want to live with the noise, here's what I have found works a heck of a lot better. This is the 12-inch clutch disc that came with this T19. The 6.9s ran a single mass flywheel. The 7.3s, as far as I know, all the 7.3s with the ZF5 ran a dual mass. The dual mass is a dampener. It's got more dampening than it has dampening in the flywheel itself. It's got dampening in the clutch disc. It helps eliminate the rollover noise. The single mass flywheels don't have any dampening in them, so all your dampening has got to come from these dampening springs. I was running a 12-inch flywheel. It's a factory flywheel with the 6.9, and I went with a different clutch kit because you have to switch out your clutch kits when you go from a T19 to a ZF5. Why? The input shaft is a different size with a different spline count. It will not fit, the ZF5 input shaft will not fit this clutch disc. So I had to go with a different one. For cost, originally I tried running the factory 6.9 12-inch flywheel and running a different but still a 12-inch clutch kit. Now, I didn't get a lot of dampening springs. I believe I got just as many dampening springs as I have in this clutch kit. And these dampening springs are the only thing that are dampening the thrust pulsations from the motor. So if you go to a bigger flywheel, like an aftermarket single mass for a 7.3, and bolt that onto your 6.9, which you will, you get a bigger diameter flywheel, and you can run a bigger clutch disc, which means you get more dampening springs. And that is the only way you can really curb the amount of noise. I'm not saying you're going to cure your gear rollover. You're going to make it a heck of a lot quieter though. And for me, that's fine. The transmission in my Ford Mustang with the factory flywheel and clutch, it has rollover noise at idle. And it came that way from the factory. I do not believe, nor have I heard definitively, that rollover will actually destroy your transmission. I don't think it does. Yes, hammering on your gears is probably not good, but I don't think that you're going to get that. This transmission has rollover going on. The gear teeth in here are chattering at idle. You just don't hear it because of the fluid dampening of the thicker oil. So I really don't think rollover is going to kill your transmission, but it is noisy. Trying to cut down on that, I would say, is beneficial. But if you are on a really tight budget, you can go down to your auto parts store. I went down to the local O'Reilly's and I got a 12-inch clutch kit. It will bolt on. You don't need to change your factory flywheel out on your 6.9. But if you go to the junkyard, or if you can spend a little bit more, I recommend getting a bigger flywheel so you can run a bigger clutch disc, so you have more dampening springs, so you can quiet down this input noise. You can overfill your transmission too. I do not recommend that for reasons I already stated. That can do damage. So that's the big part on picking a clutch kit, and rollover noise. I also don't recommend running a different fluid in that ZF5. Run some kind of ATF or MTF. Make sure it meets the manufacturer's spec, because if it don't, you can do damage there too. So that's about all it takes to swap out your T19 4-speed for a ZF5 5-speed in a 4-wheel drive rig in your early 80s Ford trucks.